Thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to be hosting this webinar with TC Gen. And today's speaker is someone who is a widely respected expert on product development. We're joined by Mr. John Carter, who is the co-inventor of Bose's noise cancelling headphones. Mr. Carter is also the designer of Apple's new product process. And as the founder of TC Gen, he's consulted with several renowned companies. Mr. Carter has also authored the book Innovate Products Faster for accelerating product development speed and innovation. This session will last for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session for 15 minutes. If you have any questions for Mr. Carter during the webinar, please post them in the questions tab that you see on your left panel. You can make use of the chat section to network and discuss takeaways with other attendees. We have about 150 attendees joining us today. And at any point, if you feel the audio or video is not clear enough, please refresh the page. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our community comprises of users of Zoho Sprints, our agile planning and tracking tool, which helps Scrum teams to build products for their customers. Mr. Carter, we're delighted to be joined by you today. I'm now handing over the virtual stage to you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning or good evening to all that are joining me. What I'd like to do is start out by really describing what we're going to be talking today about, and that is about innovation, and I call this capital I innovation. What do I mean by capital I innovation? Basically, what I'd like to describe for you, and how do we really move the needle in terms of new innovative products or services? So that doesn't in any way diminish small I innovation, which might be to improve workflows or add additional features to a product. But I want to really talk about how you can, in fact, really transform your organization by innovation and really drive your team, your organization, your company to the next level. So we're talking about capital I innovation here as we describe these events. What I'd like to do is describe why doing the right things is not enough. And I think a good place to start here is my experience at Bose. And that is that in this example here, I was just out of MIT and I was working with Dr. Bose, the leader of the company, in a laboratory environment. I was working on two projects at the same time, just after getting out of MIT. The first was one related to a loudspeaker and trying to improve its performance no matter where in the room it was placed. And the second was in the case of a noise canceling. At the time, we just called it our headphone project, that would result in better sound for every listener. And we were working on both these programs at the same time. And I went to Dr. Bose and I said, hey, we're making much faster progress in the headphones. Why don't we focus on this? This is one of the lessons that I'd like to relay to you. And that is, innovation is about choice and it's about focus. I don't know what would have happened if we had decided to work on the loudspeaker idea instead of the headphone idea. But the fact of the matter is, because we made that choice, we were able to bring a totally new category to the market, which was noise canceling. The second thing I'd like to share with you, and I think this is really interesting, is the notion that when you look at these sort of things, often even the inventor doesn't really know what the benefits of their invention are to be. And let me describe how this came about in the headphone activity. When we first arrived at this idea, as I mentioned before, we were trying to improve the fidelity, i.e. how well the bass response would sound to the listener, how uniform it would be from listeners with eyeglasses, small heads, big heads, large ears, small ears, etc. That was our goal, and we were trying to perfect that. Well, when we started introducing this concept to customers in our Agile kind of implementation, where we would do sprints and share it with customer groups. What we discovered was that improved sound was not what people were interested in. They were much more interested in noise reduction or noise cancellation. Yet that's not what these headphones were invented to do. However, they did that very well. And the lesson here is you think you would know as an inventor how to really make a tremendous innovation, and you'd understand exactly and dearly how consumers would use the product. But the fact is, consumers themselves will actually tell you what they value. And this is why it's so important in thinking about your agile approach to think about interaction with customers and doing this sooner rather than later. There's a couple other lessons that we learned here, and one very important lesson we call don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So what we did is in the laboratory, we tried to get every last drop of performance out of these headphones by maximizing their capability across the audio band. Again, when we went to customers and showed it with them, they said this was plenty good enough. We didn't need to improve it any further. And I would imagine we spent a couple years longer delaying this product to the marketplace because we wanted to really perfect it. But in fact, our performance was out there. It was absolutely remarkable. People had no idea what to compare it to, and they were very happy with the performance level that we had. So don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Other thing that I'd like to come across, and this brings us to the focus of this talk, is that this is a lot more, innovation is a lot more than process. And the reason that I say that is that in the case of Bose, we invested heavily in research. And I know that might be looked at as a marketing slogan, but no, in fact, this was the case. We spent over 10% of what was in our product development budget just on research. And it wasn't ivory tower kind of research, but rather things like this, noise canceling headphones that would deliver new and dramatic improvements to our customer base. And this relentless allocation of budget and funding year over year enabled us to keep the edge in terms of performance of these headsets, even today as we speak. Let's talk about what we mean by more than process. So if you look at this Venn diagram on the right, you can see we have three elements: organization, process, and funding. Process is only one leg of this three-legged stool. The other two legs are just as important. Organization, and by that I mean the management, the teams doing the innovation, and the individual innovator who may have come up with the idea. And funding, this notion that you have to relentlessly allocate budget and pursue these long duration ideas in a consistent and faithful manner year after year after year. And it's those three elements, three legs of this stool, that then just define the innovation, which is really to create a protected space. And by this, we'll talk about what a protected space will be, but ideas are very fragile. And you need a way to, in fact, make sure that no one blows out of the flame out of this very, very small candle. So the other thing I'd like to really share with you is that innovation is also cultural. I don't talk very much about this in this presentation because culture is something very, very hard to change. And even for the leadership takes a long time to change. But the most important thing with culture is you have to be risk tolerant. You have to be okay with failure. And finally, when I talk about it's more than breaking rules, the fact is that if you look at innovation and how you structure it and how you deliver it and enhance it and enable it requires a few elements of process, but very few. And it's more on the boundaries of this protected space where process is required. But it's really more about breaking rules and taking risks than it is in following a cookbook. I want to also emphasize that it requires patience, lots and lots of patience, because every new idea that didn't exist before, there's a reason that it didn't exist before, and that is because it's hard, and you're going to have failures in its development. And these failures will occur all throughout its course. And you have to remember that it's all ideas are extremely fragile, and many great ideas pass very near the basket before surviving and moving on to development. Let's talk about the structure and what we talk about agile innovation and why I say it's agile innovation. And the reason is that we have these three components that we've talked about: the people, the organization. We've talked about finance and budgeting. We've talked about process, bracketed meaning from the initially and then as it exits out of a protected space, an idea that is. And it consists of these three elements. So we have governance or leadership, and that is getting the right leaders to the table. Leaders understand the process and really understand who makes what kind of decisions when. The finance, basically you need the clout to fund portfolios. Here I've suggested $10 million. Of course, this varies very much by the size of an organization. And I'll give you some good rules of thumb, in fact, that you might use a little bit in just a moment that will help you determine what is the right level of investment for your organization. And finally, process. Process, it's the last, not necessarily the least, but it is necessary, but not sufficient. And that is a process designed to facilitate and nurture the best ideas, a process to really describe how a leadership team interacts with these fragile, agile teams, and finally, a process to ensure successful transfer to development. Many good ideas do not survive the innovation stage because they can't survive the transfer to production or development activities because of resistance to the newness of the particular idea. So it's these three things that come together: governance, process, and finance, that one needs to think about. I've described this arrangement in terms of, if you will, providing a bureaucracy shield and a protected space. So these small teams, and you might consist, depending on your organization, it might be one team of a half a person. More typically, it might be a dedicated person or two working in so-called protected space. The idea is the bureaucracy shield prevents these small teams from dying in paperwork and from dying in from over management, micromanagement, what I call Seymours, where management is always asking for Seymour. What we need is to protect these fragile teams, these agile teams. I've shown on the left and the right two elements that I think are critical. One we might call the entrance exam, and that is what is a good idea, and good ideas must meet some certain criteria that I'll share with you. And then also in the protected space, through customer contact and agile sprints, you would hopefully prove product market fit. And if you can demonstrate product market fit, and you can demonstrate the technical feasibility, then this fragile idea is more robust and can pass from this protected space onto the normal product development process or production process for your company. And the idea is to create a technological and an organizational firewall around these fragile teams that you can actually implement in any size company located just about anywhere in the world, because many of these aspects are virtual. So if we look at the importance of this particular model, we see these three elements of governance, finance, and process creating a protected space where Agile teams sprint, iterate, show to customers, and harden their ideas, demonstrating product market fit. And then they can really explore what's possible. But I think we've got to touch on one of the most important aspects here, which is the notion of the teams. And how do I recommend that organizations look at this discovery process? I've shown a diagram here, which might be typical of some organizations, and that is where you have a chief product officer, might be over engineering and marketing. And there's a special setup in this protected team where we've said that there might be a VP of new product development or new product discovery. And they're overseeing these small, independent, nimble, agile teams or individuals. This scales from very small to very large. And the idea essentially is to create something very much like a situation that you'd find in venture capital. So you want to create self-sufficient environment, give these teams funding so that they're not spending all their time in meetings with managers pleading for funding, just so long as they've passed their entrance exam. And the idea is that these full stack agile teams have dedicated product management or product marketing support for product definition and in engineering in order to develop the technical aspects of these ideas. These engineering and marketing teams, Agile Team 1, Agile Team 2, typically are a mix of original team, in other words, from the organization, although some can be new hires. I think it's really important to have folks on this team who understand the culture of the organization and its value. Now, there are different ways to organize teams, and I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. One example is the functional model, where you have a marketing organization, engineering, operations, et cetera, and teams draw from the functional silos. The other is matrix, where individuals come together from those silos, but the silos are weakened, and teams assemble and disappear as projects need them. And finally, the project organization, and this is an example of the project organization, has probably the best fit for agile development. And the biggest benefits are that these teams have focus around their idea, their concept they want to bring to market. And the second is that they have, if you will, agility. They can turn quickly because they're small. Also, they have complete accountability and know what their success factors are. Cons, let's see, in comparing these to functional organizations, is these tend to be more expensive because you dedicate resources to the idea. And also, you can lose competence over time if you don't have strong technical leadership that the team technical folks can learn from and be mentored and developed. So you need to watch those two cons. But absolutely, a project-based organization is the best focus, or a team-based. Again, I want to stress, many of you from small and mid-sized companies, this can be as small as one individual. So when we talk about standalone teams, we can scale it down to a very small amount. But I would say that in general, and this is a little bit of a misunderstanding, there is a rule that's been bandied about, which is 20% time. Well, if you have 20% of your schedule available, you should spend that on innovation. I don't believe that from several different respects. First of all, where does that 20% come from? Your boss still wants you to deliver the same amount of work. So that means you either have to work extra time, or you're going to have to work in a way that causes you to do this innovation outside of working hours. The second, and I think the most important thing, is that innovation requires dedication and focus over a long period of time. The reason that idea is so potentially game-changing is it didn't exist before you came up with it. So there are going to be lots of discoveries that you're going to make, and you need to allocate the kind of time and focus and relentless attention to do that. In order to fulfill this second requirement, the need for focus over time, really recommend that innovation, while it can occur in any corner of the company and should, the capital I innovation should really have some element of a dedicated team concept around it to be ultimately successful. Let's talk about these three elements in terms of, if you will, a portfolio management kind of orientation. The organizational concepts are basically to get the right leaders to the table. Now, normally these would consist of, let's say, product marketing people and engineering leaders that would be part of the management team here. But they also have to really include those parts of the organization where the team actually transfers the idea from this protected space into the organization at large. And therefore, it's highly recommended you have someone from the sales organization or operations or other part of the organization that's going to make sure that once this idea leaves the protected space, that it can flourish in the environment that you would like it to really thrive in, which is in the full production or development area. Also, the organization needs to have big enough business cards so that they can allocate the capital and really defend the need for dedicated teams. In terms of finance, what I recommend you is you create a specific investment level for this innovation portfolio. And I'd recommend, if you can possibly afford it, make it enough to start at least 3 projects. Not all of these are going to succeed, and so it's a good idea to have several small bets running. And then finally, the process things that we've talked about have to do with this entrance examination and the exit examination that really ensure that you've got let's say, a robust idea that in fact can fit with the corporate values. Let's see how this works in terms of a process flow. So we have this leadership group, and I like to call them the venture board. This is a little bit modeled after the Silicon Valley approach, but basically the venture board oversees this process. They're obviously linked to and help formulate the overall corporate strategy and strategic roadmap of the organization. They govern the portfolio. In the diagram, at the lower left of this slide shows basically a mix of projects shown as circles. One dimension is technical risk and the other dimension is market risk. The notion here is that you'd like to have a portfolio of innovation ideas that span this kind of space from very adjacent ideas, which are high probability of success, but probably won't move the revenue that much, all the way up to new to the world ideas, which are risky, but could really make a big return for the company. The venture board oversees the budget and priority and helps identify these little small agile teams that would go into their agile development process and be guided by sprints and a series of opportunities to share the ideas and test product market fit. They're guided by the product and technology roadmap as well. You can see on the right-hand side of this flow chart a critical juncture. And this is where the teams move out of this protected space and into the wild of product development. And you can see here the grow to market and launch. And the importance is to make sure that you've got good product market fit, as well as address some of the key requirements of the company. I'll give you a great example on the last project that I worked on, which was a medium-sized technology company. And one of the things that they found was needed in this protected space was to ensure that their digital products, this was an app, had instrumentation so you could effectively measure how it was being used. Now, normally the innovation teams wouldn't have thought about something like that, but the fact of the matter is this was an important part of the company's AI methodology to get customer feedback, and they needed to insert the code so that in fact these apps would be instrumented and they could get feedback about their use. Making sure that that kind of input was into the project team before it was transferred into the normal go-to-market process was really a good idea because it enabled the organization to embrace this new product, given that it had the capability to be instrumented. What is a venture board? What is it not? Well, first thing is this is not a waterfall process or a product review board. It does not review programs. What it does is it removes obstacles from the team. It doesn't do gate reviews. It basically determines which ideas in the company are the best ones to pursue, and it invests in them and it removes roadblocks. It's not waterfall. The teams basically need to demonstrate product market fit and technical feasibility and pass their exit exam. They do all those things, will have a successful effort. It's not waterfall. And the venture board per se is not agile, but it oversees agile teams, full stack teams working on these innovation ideas. One of the most important elements of this process or this organization really is the notion of a protected space. And this is one of the most important roles of the venture board to ensure that these teams operate by different rules. In other words, you don't want to have these teams attend company meetings, all hands, sit through endless status reviews, or report on their progress. You want this team to have operated by different rules. Now you might ask, well, why can this area have different rules from the rest of the organization? Well, one very good reason is that these little full stack teams, these innovation teams, should be selected based on the quality of the people involved. And the, if you will, the product owner or the engineering tech lead should in fact be a mini entrepreneur and therefore be able to deliver to the requirements of the company without a lot of hand-holding. So we really need different rules here. We don't want a lot of bureaucracy and red tape. And if you will, these are internal startup companies. You might look at these as very small companies that could emerge and in fact bring to life and have their own general management structure and their own organizational unit, but they have to grow. They have to be protected and incubated within this space. Final point is we really need to emphasize speed, and this is where sprints and agility come from, and also avoiding the don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. What we need to do is make sure that we have an opportunity to really allow these teams to move as fast as they can, have the budgets they need to be successful, and a freedom from the bureaucracy and paperwork that many of the other organizations require. There's another really good reason about why these folks can have a different rule set and this kind of freedom. Their budgets are small. So we're not talking about a huge bet your project, bet your company kind of activities, but if we're talking about teams of 1 or 2 people and in their entirety over the time they're in this protected space, we're really talking about relatively minor budgets and therefore relatively minor damage should something happen to them in the process. So the fact is that we have risk adjusted this scenario because we don't encourage very large investments. Speaking of investments, let's talk about this and how you might look at this. Now, this table on the right is derived from Silicon Valley Venture Capital, and it's only meant to be if you will, representative of how you might think about these teams and what kind of investments that you might be looking at. In the down the rows, we see the stage pre-seed, which means friends and family, early money, maybe no money, no salary. Seed, which might be the first investment. Series A is really to grow a company, scale the organization, and ramp revenue. And then Series B is the basically the budget to expand your market. And after Series B, if the company is successful, they could go public or they'd be worth enough to be acquired by another company. You can see there's a duration here, the length of time in these stages, and also the funding per year that they might require. And you can see the objectives. Well, if we're talking about this innovation space and comparing it to venture capital, it really is in the category of pre-seed and seed. And the most important objectives are to demonstrate this product market fit, make sure that there's good evidence of traction, i.e. you've satisfied a significant market demand, or at least demonstrated the potential of doing that, as well as you've demonstrated you've got a, if you will, an ability to prove the technology and some sense of revenue. Don't have to have a detailed business plan, but you have some sense of revenue. And then at that point, Series A might be at the point where they would emerge from this protected space and go into the development organization. Now, if you look at this kind of investment, this is very, very large. And many of you are from small companies and you could never afford this kind of capital. Does that mean you can't have capital I innovation? No. You need to scale these concepts and scale these ideas. I would say, though, if you really want game-changing innovation to move the needle in your organization, you're going to have at least one equivalent dedicated headcount for this. So I know these budgets seem very, very large for small companies, and they are material investments. But I think the thing to remember here is that these are guidelines that are scalable. And for smaller companies, you could move down the investment level down to as little as one headcount. But innovation is not a part-time game, so you need at least a head count. I can see also there's questions about what is a full stack team. A full stack team, basically it comes from internet lingo or cloud and app lingo, which is full stack, mean it has the engineering and technical ability to do the user interface and design, as well as develop the app on a mobile phone, as well as develop the cloud server part of the software. So full stack means the user interface, then it means the ability to really realize the app, and finally the ability to program the server. Again, you don't need to be hung up on what full stack is in your particular industry. The notion is you need to be able to draw from the key resources that can prove the technology of the product or prove the engineering aspects. So if that doesn't, if you don't use the concept of full stack teams, that's fine. But the notion is that many products require different components or technical expertise, and you have to make sure these small agile teams either have the capability on the team or can draw from it. So here are some guidelines for if you want to scale this to a smaller organization. So one rule of thumb is that I use is about $10,000 or 10,000 euros per professional in what you might call product creation. So let's say if you have 10 people involved in new product activity or development of new offerings, you might be able to say that you could afford 10% of that, or 10 times 10K or 100K investment in this innovation space. I think one of the things I'm trying to communicate in this slide is that innovation, capital I innovation, requires real investment. And it requires real investment over time, meaning this can't be a one-shot deal where you say, well, we're going to try this for a year, and if you don't get very far, we're going to rethink things come next December. The idea is you agree to an innovation budget, you commit to it, and you stick to it year after year after year. And I think most organizations, I know it's painful, but should be able to devote approximately 10% of your existing product development or product creation budget in order to fund and fuel innovation. At this point, I'd like to begin to transfer a little bit about process. We focus on organization and we focused on funding. Let's talk about the process. I saved this for last because I think in many respects, most organizations are better set up for process than they are for funding and they are for organization. I had the opportunity to work with Apple to create their new product process, ANPP, which stands for Apple New Product Process. This was a very lightweight development agile scheme that they use to basically grow and scale. There's one thing that we used as a true north or a guiding principle for our work at Apple, which is the minimum process necessary, but no less. The minimum process necessary, but no less. What do I mean by that? Well, you need enough process so in fact you don't repeat mistakes. And that's the most important thing to realize when you talk about process, because this is a lightweight process. Really what you want to do is reduce the number of bureaucracy and the number of rules. And certainly when we created this Apple New Product Process, we really emphasize lean, lightweight, iterative kind of development process that has very few rules, but the few rules are there because they're important and meaningful, and they prevent the organization from making a mistake. We look at how this might look organizationally, and again, this scales. So the venture board in your company, if it's a small company, might be the leadership team. And this cycle that's demonstrated here describes both what occurs in the protected space as well as what occurs in the normal product development activities. On the left is basically the strategic input. This produces something called a product vision, which I'll share with you, but is basically the guidance for how to really orient your product towards the right kind of objectives. It also includes this innovation portfolio process. This is the capability to pick and choose the best ideas. And it also then fuels this new product budget as well as segmentation work that really helps guide what markets and customers you may want to look at. If you look at the agile processes, though, this is where the protected space is. And I've emphasized or I've added something called M&A process. This is mergers and acquisitions. And this is the whole notion that you don't have to invent every new idea. Some of the innovations that you may come up with involve buying another company or partnerships. And I want to make sure that that is represented as well. You can see the line, the critical juncture there. That's when the teams leave the protected space. They've demonstrated product market fit, and they can run towards the finish line and generate revenue through the new product process. Now, we talked about the notion of an entrance exam and an exit exam. And if you look at what might be described here, it's more like a report card. And by the way, we have handouts of the slides as well as these entrance and exit exams for your use after this presentation. The entrance criteria is the notion that, you've got people with an idea that maybe have been thinking about this for a couple of years, months certainly, and how do they get selected? How do they be chosen? Well, the venture board uses this scorecard to ensure that the team has the following met the following hurdles. And there's really only one thing I'd like to represent here or describe to you that's really important, regardless of your company's size or type. And that is that you need to make sure that there is meaningful commercial potential. So the last line there is ensure that there is meaningful commercial potential. This is the most important part. And I know you're gazing into a crystal ball here, but if you look at the Bose example, at the time I worked on the headphone project, we were not in the headphone market. We were just in the speaker and the radio and amplifier market, but not in headsets. So we knew that if we came out with a new headset product, that could be a very successful thing for the company. It's capital I innovation and move the needle. What I've found is the most common and commonly frustrating thing that I hear from team members who quote unquote can't get their great ideas worked on is they're really not capital I innovation ideas. They're small I ideas. They're good ideas. They should be explored and maybe even should have some investment behind them. But if you're an innovator and you think you've got something contribute to the company, make sure that there's a belief, yourself and management, that there is commercial potential, meaning if the kinks are worked out, if the technology is proven, if there's product and market fit, this will fit your customer profile and your distribution channels, and you can see a line of sight between this innovation and revenue. Extremely important. And I know it's frustrating because many people say their ideas aren't worked on, but the fact is often these ideas are not big enough to really make a difference. The exit criteria, we want to make sure we have accomplished these critical factors. So these are basically what one should ask, the venture board should ask of these teams in terms of have they really tested the product market fit and verified that in fact this solves a real customer need. Have the kinks, bugs, and challenges been worked out from the technology? Do we understand the use cases, the personas or people that will use or influence or interact with the product? Do we have a feel for what the development cost is going to be, i.e., what is the total investment? I mentioned as well the importance of a product vision. And a product vision is really what distinguishes, in many cases, a small I innovation from a capital I innovation. And that product vision is something that should guide your individual innovation thoughts and activities. And it basically informs what is a good idea from a bad idea. Going back to the Bose example, we had some very, very simple product vision statements. One is great sound from a small package. And the other is that better implies different, but not the other way around. You couldn't just slap a logo on something and think that you've got a great product. It actually has to be different and deliver value. If it's just different for being different's sake, there's no value generated. It's just a different idea, not a great idea. And great sound from small packages really guided our innovation to create very, very small radios or other devices, computer speakers that really sound great for very, very small enclosures. This is the process that we've described, showing the venture board over the agile sprints and the go-to-market process. You can see that various processes, either discovery or new product ideas or M&A, can feed these teams. And we recommend that the teams essentially follow this core team model. So these small agile teams should really try and make sure that they've got the core covered, at least the product manager and development lead, and then a project manager or a scrum master to help them out as they move forward through the process. Last thing I'd like to leave you with is this really, it's a very useful concept because you think, well, we'd like to create a protected space, but we all work in one building and we just can't afford to, rent someone a garage or a co-working space. How can we achieve this? Well, basically you can achieve it technologically, and you can essentially use a technical firewall to create your protected space. For example, you remove the teams working on the discoveries, on these Agile Innovation teams. You don't feed them the Slack channels for the main corporate information flow. They have their own Slack channels. They have their own email address. And I've seen this work very well. It's created a really incredible virtual firewall because so much energy is really, unfortunately, used in many companies for purposes of communication and alignment and so forth. These discovery teams don't need that. They need a protected space to innovate. And also, we highly recommend that if the teams are in this protected space, that they don't need to attend town halls, staff communication meetings, departmental meetings. They should be focused purely on value creation and value delivery. Well, I'd like to wrap up and say that if you look at the Agile Innovation, it has several aspects. And I've given you some examples both from Bose and from Apple that describe many of these different elements. In the case of funding with Bose, or the element of focus that we used to create products like the headphones and Bluetooth speakers, or in the case of Apple, where you want the minimum amount of process but no less, and the idea that you have independent teams that are capable of delivering a product idea to market quickly. You can draw from these two experiences. But again, we're talking about a range of companies on this call. And the most important thing to realize in all these cases is the idea starts out with you. It starts with a single person. All ideas come out of the head of one or maybe a small number of people. And so what I've tried to do in our 45 minutes together is really describe to you the ability that people have actually within themselves to deliver really great capital I innovation products or projects. But don't forget that it starts with you. Thank you very much. Yes, I'll ask if there are any questions or elements of the presentation you'd like to understand better. Individual asks, the structure in slide 8 is really expensive for a small-time startup, as rightly pointed out. How do we overcome that? Will outsourcing a small part of it work out? That's a great example. Let's go to that chart. I think probably they're referring to this chart here. And yes, it's very expensive for a small time startup. Now, there are two factors I think you need to consider. The first is that a startup basically is an innovation team. And we talked about the importance of focus when we talked about the example at Bose. So in the case of a small startup, I might suggest that the initial business plan is actually what works on the capital I innovation, and that all the energy and fiber of the team should be focused on making that effort successful. Now, what if you have an innovation? Well, if it's a capital I innovation, it's huge, you could go back to your funders and raise capital for that new idea. Or if it's not a capital I innovation, then you need to find vehicles in order to get those improvement ideas into the product. But I would say that unfortunately, this structure is probably not applicable to a startup because the startup is in many respects, by definition, a capital I innovation team. And given startup's budget isn't large, you would expect that the funding would go towards that original idea. The second question is, please, these slides are available and send them by mail. We will follow up and make sure you can access those. I described what was meant by a full stack team. It's basically a self-sufficient team. And there's a question here. Let me just share you. Which is, do you just wait until the teams reach the final exam, or is there a way they can fail faster along the way? For sure. And I think the quality of a new product activity that's successful does kill ideas early. The whole notion is that these small discovery teams and the venture board overseeing this process will be watching the progress of the various teams. And in fact, if they can't demonstrate product market fit or can't demonstrate their ability to remove technical glitches, then in fact they should be defunded. The members should go back into the organization and a new effort should be funded. So absolutely, you should not wait for the final exam. In using the notion of a sprint, and these discovery teams are working in sprints, there should be ample feedback to say that the teams are not proceeding and therefore should be disbanded. And we talked about the structure in slide 8 is really expensive. I didn't talk about outsourcing, and I think this is a great comment. Absolutely, yes. In the last innovation organization that I put up with, we had one team that actually only had 2 members from the company working on it, product person and a technical lead. But there was a lot of engineering required. And so they contracted with an app development firm in Chicago to help with realization and also help in developing for the Android as well as the Apple mobile phone platforms. So I'd like to highlight that outsourcing a small part or even a large part can be instrumental in making sure that you can accelerate these kind of ideas quickly to market.
Thank you, Mr. Carter, for sharing your experiences with Bose and Apple. And we appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and also answering the questions from our community. If some of our members want to learn more about some of the processes and the checklist that you mentioned in your talk, is there a website that they can download this to? We've also made available a couple of checklists to them, but if they'd like to learn more about the processes that you're sharing with the community, is there a website where they can learn all of this from?
Yeah, there's probably a couple places I would go. If you want to look at the book I've written, you can certainly get that as a Kindle or a printed book from Amazon. And with regard to this talk, you could visit our site, tcgen.com, tcgen.com. There's a couple sections that are relevant. One is on product strategy, and the other is on product portfolio management. And the third is product development process. So I think if you look on the site, you can find various tools and resources on those pages: product strategy, product portfolio management, and product development process. And also we have a tools section where we have 40 tools from our book that can be downloaded as well. So I think if you just go there, you can probably find the resources that you need.
For more updates about our future webinars, you can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter and LinkedIn. We're by the handle at Zoho Sprints.